For those of you just joining, my name is Catherine Stewart and I am the Artistic Director at New Hampshire Theatre Project, and I will be facilitating the conversation tonight. We won't be able to see your face or hear you as yet if you are an attendee, but you can see and you should be able to see our lovely panel. I would encourage you to put a gallery view up so you can see multiple faces, but also feel free to click in the top right for speaker view if you'd like to just focus on the single person speaking. Excellent. So, again, we are here joined by a panel who's going to introduce themselves in just a moment. I am going to take this moment, attendees, to welcome CJ Lewis to our event, and he's going to speak a little bit about how the Q&A function is going to work in tonight's event.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So over the course of our first 40 minutes or so together tonight, as you're listening to the panelists, we want to encourage you to submit questions that we are that we'll field to them when we're through hearing from each of their individual experiences on the Shipyard Project. So at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a button that simply says Q&A. And you can use that to submit any questions that pop into your head while you're listening. I will do my best to curate those questions based on the conversation as it's happened up to that point. I might also promote you to a panelist if it seems like you might have something worthwhile to add to our conversation tonight, which again is our goal primarily. So, if that does not work for you, we'll be able to communicate in the chat, or if you're uncomfortable doing that. We don't want to put anyone on the spot tonight. Great, I think that's all for me.
Excellent. So thank you again. I see a few more attendees are joining, but I just wanted to give a little brief background of Community Connectors. New Hampshire Theatre Project is an applied theatre company based here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We were founded in 1988, and Community Connectors is a program that partners our main stage. It allows for us to dig in deeper into the topics in our main stage. And here we are going to be looking at a project that had a profound effect on the artists here in the Seacoast, and then a much wider reach, as we're seeing here tonight as well. The ethos of Community Connectors, although we use the term panel, when we are sitting in our 50-seat black box theatre in Portsmouth's West End, we're sitting in a circle, and we can't do that tonight, and that makes me sad. And so, as CJ said, in order to handle the conversation, we chose to explore Community Connectors with a panel that we can see and then attendees who we don't currently yet see. We are trying our best to explore what that means for the community conversation. So I do want us all to be thinking about how we're sitting in a circle tonight. I know there are people sitting there in our attendee room that had a huge part to play in this project, and the many projects and programs that came after this. We see you. You're with us. We're all here together. And so please do use that Q&A function. Please do join in. This is an hour-long conversation, not long for such a big topic. And as I've just said to the panelists, we will not cover everything. We won't get to everybody's experience. We won't get to all the profound thoughts that we want to have, but that's okay. This is an hour. We're here to have part of a conversation, and hopefully this sparks more connections, more conversations, more tomorrow. You will be hearing from me in an email tomorrow as well, with more thoughts and feelings and things added in as well. So I really take it very seriously that this is just a snapshot. And I do want to just acknowledge that sometimes there's technical difficulties. If there is, I know I'm going to take a deep breath, plant my feet on the ground, take a moment, and then move on. I hope you do the same. Okay, so with that, we are going to quickly introduce the panel that we have in front of you so that you know who is in the room. And I'm just going to ask them to do that with their name and what their role or their participation in the project was. I'm going to call on each of you in order to do that. So let's start with Paula, I'll come to you.
Paula Race. I was a co-director of the project with Jane Hirshberg at the Music Hall. I had just started working at the Music Hall when the second of the Lila Wallace grants came through, which enabled us to do the major part of the project, which was the performances and the community meetings. And it was just an amazing experience for me to be that involved. But then I went on to do a lot of the projects that ripple affected from the Shipyard Project, the Neighborhoods Project with Genevieve, the Portsmouth Poet Laureate Program, all of these projects that came out of the Shipyard Project, many of them I was part of as well, which was a terrific legacy.
Thank you, Paula. Jane Forde.
Hi, I'm Jane Forde. I was the artistic director at the Music Hall just after the Shipyard Project was finished. I arrived at the Music Hall in 1997, and so I was blessed with the opportunity of taking all of the wonderful connectedness that had happened during the Shipyard Project, linking in with all the different people that had connected with it, and had a really rich a root system to really help to build the education and community outreach program at the Music Hall from then onwards.
Thank you. Chris Dwyer.
Hi, I'm Chris Dwyer, and I was the chair of the board of the Music Hall at the time when we decided to develop the project, and worked with Jane Hirshberg in the early times of the project. And I've been a part of a lot of the subsequent things that have happened in our community, including, I think, probably most recently, the African Burying Ground Project, to see our community take on and be able to know that we can take on major community projects.
Thank you, Chris. Peter Bowman.
Hi, my name is Peter Bowman, and my function on the Shipyard Project was on the advisory panel or advisory board, which I reluctantly was persuaded to join. And then my other major function during the Shipyard Project was as a dancer. And I have an anecdote, if I have an opportunity later, that Liz and I shared about my dancing abilities, but now is not the right time to do that.
Thank you, Peter. We'll definitely come back to that. Sarah Duclos.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Duclos, and I was a student at Ballet New England, and I participated in the Shipyard Project between 1994 and 1996 and participated in the final performances, and I grew up to be a dance educator and choreographer.
Thanks, Sarah. Jane Hirshberg.
Hi, everyone. I worked with Chris Dwyer to scheme and dream about this project and followed it through to its end. It was a life-changing experience for me in multiple ways, not the least of which was that eventually I ended up working for 13 years directly with Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, and which was also transformative. So the project, I refer to it probably daily, at least in my thoughts and oftentimes in my conversations with people.
Thank you. Genevieve Aichele.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Aichele. I'm the founding executive director of New Hampshire Theater Project. And I was involved in some of the workshops and programs with the Shipyard Project. But mostly I date that point in my life as when I met Liz and I saw the work that she was doing, that it inspired me that this is what I had always wanted to do with theater instead of dance. And New Hampshire Theater Project has gone on to do a lot of other programs like that. I also directed Neighborhoods. I think we had a cast of 40 from ages 6 to 85. And we toured it around the city of Portsmouth. And we went on to do a number of other projects with NHTP. I keep saying project. But I also just wanted to point out that when Catherine first came to me, when we first got to know each other, she pointed out that she had studied this project at university. And that's when I knew that she would be the great next person to run our company.
Thank you, Genevieve. And now I'm going to come to you, Liz, to share your relationship to the project, and then also a recollection that maybe comes to top of mind.
Thank you. It's so beautiful to see everybody, and you know, it just is sort of all swimming back at me, and probably I'll get emotional just because it was such a magnificent. You know, sometimes the stars line up and the constellation happens, and this was one of those times. So just so much gratitude to everybody. I was the artistic director of the Dance Exchange and asked to come to Portsmouth by Jane, by Paula, by all of you, and by this amazing community, and by the Shipyard, and welcomed in such an incredible way. I have 1,000 stories. I mean, I think the project, one of the things that I learned from this project was just the stories and stories upon stories upon stories. And some of those are written in the bodies, and some are written, you know, in the yard itself, and some are written in just the kind of story circles we had. There's so many, but what came to mind, actually, I talked to Catherine earlier and we discussed this, is maybe one I don't tell as often, because there's some iconic stories that I tell about the Shipyard, and I have people approach me and say, tell that one again. It's like, will you tell that one over again? The one about the officers' wives, will you tell that one again? So this is a little bit different, and it's 2 parts. It's about the bridge, actually, about the bridge between the yard and the town. And, you know, we had wanted to get the bridge moving so that we could dance on it, and that was declined, but they did agree to close the bridge at the final, the day of the final event, which went on and on and on, because there are many parts of the day. So someone, I don't remember who, came up to me and said, okay, Liz, for 2 years you've been talking about how powerful art is. I finally know it's powerful because you got them to close the bridge. And I just love that, for the way in which people begin to animate all kinds of words or think about things. But on the day that the closing day, we had that amazing group of sailors marching with us, and you know, we came from all parts of the town, and we met on the bridge, and then the mayor, Eileen Foley, tied these 2 pieces of ribbon together that had come each from different sides of the town, which was beautiful. It was amazing to see that happen, but to understand that she was the same person who had cut the ribbon when the bridge was first opened, as she was 5. And my understanding, and perhaps this is apocryphal, and that's how good stories flow through time, is that the reason she cut the ribbon and not her sister is because her sister's front teeth had come out, and that her mother wanted someone who could smile. So I just think of how there's so much wrapped up in that story about any number of metaphors we could draw on, but not the least is how we came together and allowed her to tie that ribbon again.
Thank you so much, Liz. I like thinking about that, and what the gap-filled smile what that photo might have looked like. I'm going to take this moment to say to our attendees and to our panelists that we are running a poll tonight, as that is a function on Zoom, and why not try them all out, right? That lets the attendees tell us how they participated in the project, if they did, and what their participation was. So I can see that we have some performers, we have some organizers, individuals who were audience members, and we're almost at half and half, people who are in our attendee room who did participate and half who did not yet. Just some interesting information. Chris, I think I want to come to you next to try and talk about those really early days. And as we're thinking about how these kinds of large projects come together, what were those feelings in the first few days? And then as Chris goes on, if there's any of the other panelists who have other early memories, maybe let's explore some of the beginnings of the project. So Chris.
Well, I think it's, you know, this is over 2 decades ago, and the whole position of organizations like the Music Hall has really changed over that time. So it's hard to think back then, but presenting organizations like the Music Hall tended not to do more than present, which meant that they took out-of-town shows, maybe one night, and this was true of all presenting organizations. But around that time, there were projects evolving in different parts of the country where different kinds of organizations, sometimes the presenting organizations, were getting more involved with their communities and with longer term engagements where there really could be that interaction. And I was involved in that because of my professional work with some of the national foundations that were supporting that work. And it really seemed important for the Music Hall to have that kind of profile in Portsmouth, to me, that the Music Hall was, I think at that time, and I'll be interested in Jane Hirshberg's and Paula's perspective, but I don't think that most community members would have thought of the Music Hall as a community arts organization at that time, but as a presenting house. And local artists didn't really have a place in the Music Hall. And so that was something really important to me from what I could see in other parts of the country. I know it was important to members of the staff of the Music Hall. And so it seemed like a way to jumpstart a kind of relationship between the institution and the community that that would be a different kind of institution. Now, the Music Hall had presented Liz as a performer, so we had the relationship of knowing Liz's work and being attracted to Liz's work. So as she had said a few minutes ago, sometimes the stars kind of align. We already had the familiarity in the community by some people of Liz. We had the need, I thought at least, and some small group of people thought, I think at the time, to change the profile of the Music Hall. And it's also hard to remember back at that time that, you know, we didn't have all the community arts organizations that we have now. So we had a real need in the community for expanding what the arts meant.
Thank you, Chris. I'm wondering, Jane Hirshberg, if I can come to you now to speak a little bit about the advisory committees, but then also, and you might not be the best person to speak to this, where did that spark of this is about the Shipyard project, this is about the Shipyard come from? Do we remember that? Yeah, Jane.
Yeah. So actually, it was during that time, there was, that was during the BRAC commissions, the base realignment and closure commissions. I can talk about the advisory committee all day, so I'm just gonna get this part of the question out of the way. And that was under Bush 1, where many military complexes were being, you know, taken on and off a list of whether or not they were gonna be closed. The military, the defense budget was being cut. And the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard kept on going on the list, and then it would come off the list, and it would go on the list, and it would go off the list. And it was really traumatic for the families who were working. I mean, it was almost 200 years that families in the area had been working at the shipyard, because there were civilian people as well as military people who worked at the base. And it was pretty clear that as there was an organization that had been founded called Save Our Shipyard that Captain Bill McDonough had founded, and they were busily advocating to keep the yard open. And the shipyard was in the news a lot, and it was the issues around keeping the shipyard open were complicated because it was a nuclear, they built nuclear submarines there, and so there were people who were environmentalists who felt passionate about the yard, you know, not being there because of the environmental impact, but the reality is that the economic engine that was supplied by the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and the legacy of the work going on there I think was incredibly meaningful to the entire community, no matter where they were on the political spectrum. I could be wrong, but that's what I was told. And then the more I learned about the people, the more I definitely started to feel the same way. So the first person that I called, so Chris, as I mentioned before, had some familiarity with opportunities for longer term engagements with artists that presenters could be involved with around the country. And she already was very involved in the community and knew that it might be really interesting to do an exploration of the shipyard as an organization where people work and where there are stories, and that there is something, you know, I don't know what it was, Chris, but there was something about it that you knew that there was a lot to mine there in all of what was going on with the BRAC commissions, with the stories that lived in the yard, with people in the community that felt a connection to the yard one way or another, including Mayor Foley, who worked there, in addition to cutting the ribbon to build the bridge. And she was the first person that I called. And when I called her and told her what we were up to, she was not fazed at all. It was as though I was telling her, good morning, how are you today? Oh, yes, you're going to make an art project about the shipyard. Sure, you need to call here, and within seconds, I had about 25 names of people who I needed to call, and I did. And the very first thing that we did was, and for each person, of course, that I called, they had 25 more people that I needed to call. And that was the very, very beginning of the advisory committee, because we decided that the first thing we needed to do was have a meeting to talk about what is this idea, what might we do? And that very first meeting was incredible. Peter, I don't know if you were at that very first meeting. Harold Whitehouse was there, and there were all kinds of great people there, some retirees, some current workers, some dancers, a few teachers. There were about 20, 25 of us that were at that very first meeting to talk about what this might be. And Liz and Peter DeMuro and Thomas Dwyer were all there. And it was a moment where I think people started to see the possibilities for how their stories could be animated in such a way that it would be an amazing way to translate the impact of the work that had gone on at the yard, but also people started to think about their work, even in that meeting, as something artful, something that absolutely could be choreographed, or could be told in a story, or could be, you know, all the other amazing things that we did. So songs written about it. So that first meeting was about 25 people came out of about 125 people that I invited. I think a number of the people came only because the letter that I sent had a quote from Bill McDonough on it, because we got him on board early on. And so people thought, well, if Bill says I should come, I should come. And people actually said that at the meeting. And then that became our committee. Those 25 people basically followed the project for the next 2.5 years. They came, they went. There were other people that came into the group. And the committee met for a year before we, because the brilliance of the funding that we got from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, which is what it was called at that time, was that they would give a planning grant, and then you could apply for an implementation grant, depending on how's it going in your community. Is this something that you're getting response from? Do the artists want to do it? Does the community want to do it? Is there juice? And I remember at the end of that first year of meeting monthly, where we were learning all kinds of stories and crying and laughing and figuring out all kinds of things if we were going to get the grant. And then there was a site visit, and we invited the site visitor to one of our committee meetings, and I didn't have to do anything. I mean, it was just the people who were in the committee and who were connected to the yard. Peter, you were probably at that meeting.
Yeah,
and Claire Bloom was there. Remember Claire Bloom?
So yeah, I'm gonna thank you, Jane. That's
I'm sorry. I told you I could talk all day about it.
No, so you've given us lots to look at here, right? Like we're building community energy. We've got artists at the table very early on. We've got people across fields. We've got kind of the heavy hitters all there, the foundational pieces, and there's financial support for planning and not just projects. These are all really interesting things for us to think about. Peter, I'd love to come to you now to speak from your perspective, and maybe this is the moment to share your anecdote about dance as well. And also, Liz, I'd love to hear your experience of coming in at this stage. But yeah, Peter.
Well, thanks, Catherine. My initial impression of this project was that it was doomed to failure, and I didn't want to be any part of that because it was my shipyard, I guess you could say, or at least briefly it was, and I worried about the impact that my association with the project might have, and I think, I'm not sure others can appreciate that, but I sure did. But in fact, the result of the project was the antithesis of that. It was the exact opposite. As I think it was Jane had mentioned, the process, the Shipyard Project, participation in it was very much, especially for me, but for all of us, I think, was very transformative in nature. So I won't run out of time to tell my little anecdote. So I joined the advisory committee late. Because of my reluctance to be part of something that I thought might fail, I joined late. And so I was interviewed, Liz interviewed me, and so I've never met a more persuasive person in the world than Liz Lerman. And so if I had doubts going into the interview, I walked away with zero, none. And then she said, well, Peter, because of your unique position at the shipyard, I think that I know that I want you to be part of the advisory committee. And I said, well, Liz, I walked into this interview thinking no, but I'm leaving it now thinking yes, I would like to be a part of that. And she said, well, Peter, you know that all advisory committee members will dance. And I looked Liz in the eye and I said, Liz, you need to know something about me. I don't dance. And she looked me in the eye, much more powerfully than my eyes were. And she said, Peter, you don't understand. Everybody and anybody can dance. And that I've been dancing the rest of my life, in a sense. So that's my the Liz Lerman dance story. But the Shipyard Project, to me, I mean, it is many things to many people. But what it was a call for all of us that participated, whether you participated as a performer or as an attendee. And it basically said, or one of the things it said to me, is make the arts a bigger part of your life and the community's life. Create art, create organizations and things. And that's why Paula and Nancy Hill started the Poet Laureate program. I mean, and the rest is history, as they say. And yeah. I want to let other people talk, but I was so happy that that Liz persuaded me to be a part of the project, because it changed my life forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Liz, I'm going to jump back to you for just a second and ask you, if you remember that conversation, feel free to tell your anecdote, your version of that anecdote. But also, I've heard you talk, and Jane just mentioned it there, and Peter just mentioned it as well, an outpouring of stories that came. Did that really feel like a rich and fertile ground for making something, or was it not always the case? Where did the stories start to come from? Oh, I'm just going to unmute you, Liz.
Yeah, Peter, I remember that. I remember some other things too that we'll discuss about talking with you, because it was always so interesting and is interesting. But Catherine, in answer to your question, the story started immediately. But some of that is partly the way artists hear and what we had come to understand. Sometimes people think, oh, I don't really have a story to tell. They have a story the minute they say, hey, Liz, do you know how the subs actually work? No, I don't. Well, let me tell you. And then they're into explain, and there's buried, not even buried very far. First of all, they're busy moving. Well, it does this, it does, and you're collecting all that. But stories also start because we all have such interesting ways to connect. Part of why it meant so much to me is, my mom had worked during the war on a secret project for Howard Hughes. She'd been building a boat, and she never, we got to see it during the St. Lawrence Seaway when it opened up and the boat came to Milwaukee. And I think, I hadn't talked about any of that, I hadn't told that, and somehow bringing that up right there at the beginning, like my own history, my own connection, my own puzzlement about all of these things was there for all of us. And I think that partly that transparency of the openness of everybody just to jump in. And of course, we also heard that night about the Thresher. And when I realized there were people in that room, the engineers who built the Thresher and people whose families had been on the Thresher were all in that room together, and that just that one invitation that you guys made, let them be in the room together in a way that we could maybe address some of that, that was so powerful. I realized, and then you start to see how over time you build these relationships and these trusts, and yes, you make funny dances and not funny, and you do, but then there's other things that start to come up for people that are amazing. And it started that night.
Wow. Thank you. So I'm going to remind our attendees that you can be sending your questions to the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. You can be sending those. CJ's looking through them. We also have some other comments coming up that I think we will be inviting a few attendees to join our panel in just a moment, but I've got a few more questions for the panelists here. Sarah Duclos, I want to come to you because you were a youth participant in the project, and so did not necessarily have an awareness of all of this organization going on. What was participation like for you from your point of view?
Well, first of all, my very first day at rehearsal, it was sort of handed down from our ballet director. There is this thing happening and you will participate in it. And if anyone watching remembers Misha Jurek, he's a very formidable person. So if Misha told you to show up and do something, then you showed up and you did it. But up until that point, so my first rehearsal with the dance exchange, I was only 12 years old. And I showed up with my point shoes in hand and my black leotard and my pink tights and my bun pulled very, very tight in the back. And I have such a distinct memory of one of your company members, Liz, Jeffrey, looking at my point shoes and looking at my little 12-year-old face and saying, "Oh, honey, you're not going to need those." And I had absolutely no idea what I was in for. So I tucked my little shoes away and I walked in and we were told to roll up our tights. I'm like, oh my God, my little mind was exploding. But what followed from there, and I would say I have so many takeaways from this project, much like Jane was saying, I talk about it constantly. I refer back to it constantly. But I think the biggest thing that I took away was up until that point, I was only studying ballet and my worldview and my view of dance was incredibly narrow. I only knew about European dance traditions, and that was how I was trained, and that was everything, my whole world. I wanted to grow up and dance for American Ballet Theater. And when Liz and the Dance Exchange came into my life, I think that it really opened up a world of possibilities for me about what dance could be and what it had the power to do. And it was mind-blowing, and it's something that I still carry with me today, and I'm so grateful that I had that experience at a very formative age. And I've been very fortunate in my career to go on and do work like that elsewhere. So it's really a gift.
Thank you. And so that moves us into a piece talking about the legacy that I'd like to just come to very briefly before we open this up to questions from our attendees. I'm holding a little booklet here that was written and kind of compiled this. And Paula, I want to come to you for the moment and ask you kind of about documentation and what came next. And Jane and Genevieve, I'd love to hear your thoughts as Paula is speaking as well about what was really sparked in the community after this, but then also with that line of why is documentation and support for documentation of these works maybe also crucial as well. Paula, what legacy is there for you?
Oh my gosh. The Shipyard Project, again, is one of those things that I can't say enough about how it changed my worldview of these kinds of community arts projects. When the Shipyard Project ended and Jane went off to join the circus and, you know, everything just stopped, we kept having meetings, right, Peter? We kept having meetings and we were like, okay, now what? And Genevieve joined in and we just could not stop the experience. It was like crack, everybody was hooked. So we kept following the same process and talked about it and threw ideas up, and eventually a few very juicy subjects came to mind. Jen was really interested in doing something in theater, which was new for this group. Harold Whitehouse talked about the North End and the scar of that whole urban renewal that happened, and that became neighborhoods. And we followed the process that Liz had brought to us with Dance Exchange of interviewing people and getting all those stories and getting all those perspectives and creating art from it. Had community actors. We were on the stage at the music hall. We had original music performed. My dad was in it. He had just moved here. It was amazing, and it brought up a lot of discussion and a lot of healing, because it was a lot of controversy, like the Shipyard, and it changed people's minds. It brought up stories people didn't know, and so their perspectives softened, and it did heal the community, I think, in many ways. And from that, other projects grew as well. The World Sits Down to Dinner, many of us were involved in, about hunger. The Poet Laureate program began out of a Building Community Through Culture grant that Nancy Hill and John Wheeler got. It just, you know, one thing kept leading to another, and because many of us were overlapping in involvement, we were able to capture the story and the history and make the threading connections to how they engendered the next project.
Thank you, Paula. So Jane Forde, I'd like to come to you. You came to the head of the music hall at this time, and you talked to, when you started, about the energy that was given at that time. What challenges did you face when moving beyond the Shipyard Project? Were there any?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I came in first to the music hall as the education and outreach director, and it was a bit of a void. No one in the building was sort of talking to me about what was happening. And then there was all this, suddenly there was this thing about, oh, this Shipyard project. I mean, I had come from away, so I didn't know this community at all. I didn't know New Hampshire, didn't know anyone. What was very, very soon became very apparent was this had been an amazing a project for the whole community of Portsmouth, and the music hall had been central to that, and it allowed that to happen. And so I was able to find the connections to the people and start to understand where the music hall was now going to be and how it could possibly connect and keep connecting, and perhaps be a little catalyst to help some of these things happen. I met with Genevieve and Paula and Nancy Hill and all of those folks, and started to just, you know, introduce myself and try and find out what they were doing and how, as the person in the music hall for education outreach, I could assist that and become involved and create. And so making partnerships and really trying to find ways to open the music hall even more to enable people to come in and use the artists that were coming in, bring in artists from the community into the music hall and try and build on what had been started and had created such an incredible life-changing experience to many, many, many of the people of Portsmouth that now needed to be continued and celebrated and worked on, and listening to voices. It was fabulous that there was suddenly all of these people from very different parts of the community that all had an interest and a connection that you could feed in. So when you went to any other community, it was about the artists, and you may have a few other people here that you can join in with. But the richness was incredible. The root system, I said, was so strong there, and there were people that, little branches that you could join, and these branches were going all over, and there was a myriad of things happening, and it was so exciting, and it was a wonderful, fabulous, beautiful place to be landed.
Thank you, Jane. So Genevieve, I'll come to you, and then we'll be returning CJ to our screen, and we'll move into the questions. What legacy is there for you, Genevieve? What's roaming around your head now?
Well, there's a lot of things in my head, but three things. First of all, many of us have mentioned Nancy Hill, who we lost a few years ago, and I just wanted to give her tribute. For many reasons. As you can hear, she was involved in a lot of these, but also she was really the person that found the funding for Paula and I and Judy Rigmont, along with the New Hampshire State Arts Council, to create that little booklet you held up. And you asked, why is documentation important? Well, we're all talking about 20 years ago. This was a seminal project that changed the city. And 5 years ago, I gave a speech to Leadership Seacoast. Not a single person in the room had ever heard of the Shipyard Project. And that's how short our memories are. And that's why documentation is important. But Russ Grazer from Portsmouth Music and Arts Center had a question, and it was one I was going to talk about, and I'd like to have Chris address it because she was right in the thick of it. But those of you who think of Portsmouth now as this wonderful cultural city, there wasn't always as fond a connection between the arts and the city government. And the Shipyard Project changed all that and really led to a Blue Ribbon Commission for the Arts that Evelyn Sorrell appointed, and led to the arts being an important part of the cultural plan. So I'd like to ask Chris if she could address that, because she was certainly a huge part of that.
Yeah, so I'm also going to take this moment to ask CJ to come back, as if we're moving into the questions, that's great, because he's been keeping an eye on them as well. So we'll have CJ join in. But yeah, Chris, to Russ's question that I think he popped in the chat.
Well, Jen is exactly right. It is hard to believe at that time that, if you were a community leader, or as a few years later I was a city councilor, and you were associated with the arts, people pigeonholed you, and you were thought of as, not a serious person. Even though I was also the finance and budget and math person, if you were associated with the arts, that's all you were, and you were not a serious person. And that's how the government relationship, I think, particularly looked at the arts. And that was certainly true of Evelyn Sorrell, who became mayor after Eileen Foley. But Evelyn was a person who tremendously grew in office as mayor. Evelyn was the scourge of the music hall before she became converted to being the one who set up this commission to do the arts. She didn't think children should be going to the music hall for school day performances because the buses were in the alley and they were blocking traffic. And that was a constant police problem. And then a few years later, Evelyn is the person who says, well, all cities in New Hampshire have a master plan, but none of them have culture in their master plan. Why don't we have that? And so with her foresight as a person who completely turned around, and it was obviously not only the Shipyard Project, but a lot of the spin-offs that were happening, but to be able to see the community aspect of the Shipyard Project, Evelyn wanted a cultural plan because she didn't want all arts to be downtown. Evelyn wanted arts to be throughout the city and to be something, as she would say, for the people. And to her, that meant neighborhood, that meant a bigger vision. And so it was really, it's hard to believe in a few straight years, Evelyn was the one, not, you know, it wasn't those of us who'd been involved in the arts, it wasn't Mayor Foley, it wasn't other people, it was Evelyn, who was a true convert, who was the one who opened the path for the cultural plan.
Thank you, Chris. So over to CJ. I'm sure we've got lots of questions and lots of people out there looking to speak.
While we're talking about specifically community impact, one question that came in, and Peter, I'm going to toss this right to you. What did this project do for the military community of the Naval Shipyard?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I've ever thought of that before, but I think one of the things that the Shipyard Project did for the shipyard was to give the shipyard a soul, to give it a spirit that it was lacking before. The general population in this area, in very simplified form, had two impressions of the shipyard. One was, hey, it's my bread and butter. It's something we can really be proud of. And then there were others in the community who said, you know, it's a nuclear shipyard. It can't be good. Can't be doing good things for the environment. But I think that the Shipyard Project, as I say, gave the shipyard a heart, a spirit. You know, like, what was it, the Tin Man and the heart? Remember? You know? But so that's what I think. That's what I think the impact on the shipyard was. And I was really pleased that the people that ran the shipyard at the time of the Shipyard Project were totally supportive of what we were doing on the project.
Catherine, I wonder if I could just speak also to this oddly with some thoughts. First of all, partly through Charlie Lawrence, who was just an amazing participant in the project. And it's just a legacy thing too. 5 years after the Shipyard Project, I was asked to come to Southern Michigan to talk to the foundation there because they were beginning to turn their attention to community-based projects. And they asked me to bring somebody, and I brought Charlie. And they wanted somebody from one of the community projects. And Charlie got up and he said that the shipyard was beginning to get, as workers, young people who'd been in the Shipyard Project as middle school and high school students, and that they found them to be the best new workers that they had gotten. And they attributed it to the fact that they had been engaged in storytelling and knew its history, felt connected. Now, I'm not sure that they were military. I think these must have been civilian workers, but just to say that there are implications from the project that we just never knew. I would never have known that had I not had that moment with Charlie. So I was ever grateful for that.
Yeah, I just want to point out that Charlie was the general foreman at the shipyard. So he had credibility with people in the city, and he had credibility with people at the shipyard too.
But I would also add that perception, changing narratives and changing perceptions is such a hard thing to do. Look at the United States right now. Look at us. And how do you begin what Peter just said? There are people in town who pass that shipyard every day and hated it. It's a nuclear thing, blah, 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 and there are people. How do you begin to change those things? And it doesn't happen without rehearsals. Well, what rehearsals do means constant connection. You have to get together. Oh, you may have to see you next week too. You may have to see you again in another week. It's like it's some of that part of art making that actually helps to change those narratives, or at least bring people into a multiple truths about what they're living and seeing.
Excellent. Before we move on to speaking about the legacy of this project, which is really what I think a lot of the remaining questions and comments are really about, is with an eye forward. I would like to invite on a couple folks to share very quickly their experiences. As I understand it, were folks who worked on the project with you all. So I'm going to promote Topher and Peter DeMuro to panelists here.
Wonderful. So for a second, they're going to feel like they've been kicked out of the whole thing, and then they should pop up just in front of us as well. We are nearing the our 8 o'clock mark. We might fudge that a little, understanding that some of us might have other prior arrangements, but sometimes when good conversation's flowing, we just want to keep going. So yes, CJ, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. So Peter, let's start with you. You self-identified as somebody who had some things to share about your experience on the project. So
yes, I was well, I was a new company member at the Dance Exchange in 1993. I joined, and I think it was sometime in those first days we were rehearsing in a church mess hall, or kind of the side room, which we left, by the way, because they had a funeral in there one day and we had to move on to a different space. We were very itinerant. But Liz brought up the question of that she just received this phone call from this town in New England, and I had been living in Boston before I left Boston to join the circus, as Jane did later. And so I was familiar with Portsmouth, but this idea of making a piece in the shipyard, it was profound, and we kind of toyed around with the ideas, and I felt like it was like a real big turning point. I wanted to mention that there were 5 or 6 of us new that year in the company. And as much as you felt the reverberation in Portsmouth for this project, we felt it as a company. And it was the first time that the older dancers and the younger dancers were coming together to make work together. And it wasn't a separate old people company and a younger people company. And Liz, in her infinite genius, which astounds me every day, and I feel a little teary about that, but what we found for many of us in the company, it was quite a challenge because of our, for multiple reasons, the size of the project, the military aspect, and for many of us men in the company who were gay at the time, it was the first time dealing with the military and dealing with issues that were really difficult for us. And what we processed as an internal company, after all the rehearsals were done at night, and it'd be 10:30 p.m. in the lobby of the Marriott or wherever we were, off of the Rotary right there, staying, it was profound for us. And I think also, lastly, profound for the world of community engagement. After this time in 1996, 7, whatever it was, this was a benchmark for us. It's a benchmark for me today, and it's a benchmark for people I meet out in the field from here to Tokyo, that people refer to this project. So you are well known, and kudos to you.
Thanks, Peter, for sharing that. Topher, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Hi, yes, I'd love to add a few things. Hello to everybody. Thank you so much for putting this on. This has been a walk down memory lane. The Shipyard Project was incredibly important. I know that it was important not just for me and my career and what I've done after. Like I've remained in the performing arts, and it was my first foray into a immersive performance art collective experience throughout a whole city. It wasn't just the dancers. Like I was in there with Sarah Duclos. And I was a young kid who had just come out of a big performing arts school and came into the town. And it was my first moment of meeting one of my best friends and working with Ballet New England. And she was right. Misha just said, this is what we're doing. We're doing it. And also Misha had like a smart sense about what was going to be very interesting. And this could not have been more interesting. Liz, I remember you so vividly. I don't know if you remember me. I was a very young kid at that point. But I've grown, but this, what was most impressive to me was it wasn't just one event. This was a month-long basic event where we were doing buto on islands and pretending to be cranes, and like doing a fashion show in hazmat suits, showing you all the things the shipyard brings. And like, honestly, it was a collective ohm for the city of Portsmouth. It was my introduction to, I've always known Portsmouth. I grew up there. My father was in the Air Force. I've understood what was going on. And like, Portsmouth is a town with inherent magic. It is what I tell every single human being that I've ever met in my life, that Portsmouth is, of its essence, it lives on magic, no matter how the times shift and change. However, 1990s Portsmouth was just the most groovy place ever. Like, it was down for anything. And that was what Liz and Jeffrey and everybody brought to this. It was an experience that connected the whole city, revived. The shipyard is still in working order. Like, it was on the docket to be cut out and be done. It is now still this magical, weird citadel that lives just off of Portsmouth. And you can look at it always. And there's still great work going on there. I'm sure there's issues, but Portsmouth knows how to protect its magic, and it did it very well in bringing Liz on. And everybody, thank you so much for making this project happen. I've never seen a city come together or be forced to sit through us all being there in their space. You know, I mean, we were all just, whether you wanted it or not, we are now doing a conjoined performance of energy across the city. And you just got to sit through it. And everybody did. There was no, I felt no ill will, but I did feel like I was telling a friend, it felt like a transparent Hail Mary, you know, like we're just doing it. We don't care. We're throwing the ball. We're going to keep on going and keep on throwing and keep on doing weird creations. And it was one of the most formative experiences of my life. And I've gone on to perform. And there was one question about like what it brought for the shipyard. It's not just what it brought for the shipyard. It's what it brought back to the entire city as a whole. Because it wasn't, the shipyard was on hold, but this brought us together in a way that rebuilt a whole, you know, artistic hive mind for a little while.
Thank you, Topher, so much. So we're right at our point, but I'm just wondering if there's one or two questions that we can speedily get to, CJ.
Yeah, I think I'd like to glue together a couple thoughts and questions here for a wrap up. And really, this question is about not just the legacy of this project, but what this looks like moving forward for a community like Portsmouth. What does this mean for the legacy of art making, you know, in a place like Portsmouth? And specifically, what does this mean in 2020, faced with the realities of our current situation as well? What can we learn from those years between 1992 and 1996 that we can apply today at the end of May in 2020? And why don't I'd love to start. Liz, can you kick us off with that question here? And I'd love to hear from everybody as we wrap up here this evening, if we can.
First of all, I want to just again renew the idea of invitation. We were invited. Everybody was constantly invited over and over. We invited until the very last second. In fact, somebody came up to me at the very end and said, I didn't come to a single thing except this. So the invitation continued forever. So I want to just say that that's a big part. And everybody invited everybody after a while because it was so embedded. But I also want to just talk about constraints for a minute. We had constraints. There were certain things we could not do on the shipyard. There were certain things we could not do. And with that artistic integrity and the help of the advisory committee and the willfulness of the whole everybody, we worked with and around the constraints. And lo and behold, it constructed a whole week, one thing on the yard, one thing off the yard, because not everybody could get on the yard. But we didn't want to deny that. So when we think about social distancing, or we think about the problem of touch, or we think about the kinds of things we are going to be addressing, constraints, the healing, we can put those things together and something quite amazing will emerge, I'm sure.
Thanks so much. Sarah, can I go to you? I know you had said earlier that you had a response specifically to the more COVID-related questions that were popping up.
Sure. A connecting thought that I had earlier that I forgot to mention was something that I feel I took away from my experience with the Shipyard Project was that art, whether it's ballet or theater or whatever it is, does not have to be, this is the thing that I am saying and you will now listen to it. And for the first time, I really observed Liz and the Dance Exchange listening to the community stories and responding to that to make something new and present it to them in a different way. And I saw a question earlier about what does this project mean in COVID-19, 2020, what we're all collectively going through right now. And I see many artists rushing, I feel rushing to do something, to make something, to respond, to be there. When I think the takeaway that I feel, and I feel that this is a quality that I pulled out of my experience with the Shipyard Project, is that this is a time that we should be pausing and listening. And when we listen to what people need and we listen to how people feel, then we can decide what it is that we should make.
Thanks, Sarah. Jane, you look like you had a reaction to that. Is there anything you'd like to share? It's Jane Hirshberg, I'm sorry.
As in me?
Yeah.
I just think Sarah said it really beautifully, and I appreciate that. And I also have been thinking about, actually I was just talking to Liz about this not a few days ago, that there are, when we talk about the possibilities of gathering again for performance, we know that those will have to be in small spaces with very small groups of people. And that kind of an intimate, really sacred space is something that I experienced maybe for one of the first times in my adult life, when we were doing these performances in places like churches and very small spaces, the little tiny museum. And I think that it takes a very particular kind of artistic sensibility to be able to put oneself in a space like that and think about audience, think about what the thing is that you want to be saying that is so important that people are going to actually come into a small room and risk their lives to be there. So it's, I mean, I shouldn't be laughing, but it's something that I'm living in deeply right now in my current position as we're trying to figure out how to be presenting artists in this world that we're living in. So I mean, there's a lot that we did way back then that I don't know that we could know is really informing the way that we can be now.
Thank you, Jane, so much. We are past our allotted time for this particular part of the conversation, and so I will be take the tricky job of wrapping us up just now, but just a reminder that this is by no means the end of a conversation. I've already seen that the new executive director at the music hall, who will be taking part in that position very shortly, has already asked to speak to the panelists about this project, about how the music hall proceeds from now, and I take that responsibility very seriously as well, as a new artistic director at an organization that has been around as long as I've been on this planet. I think it's really important for us to look backwards in order to think about the present moment and in order to look to the future. I really believe that art making and art making together is what will always exist. How we do that, the way we do that might change, but we can look at where we've been in order to look forward. And so I really hope to continue the conversation with me. Everybody on this call will be receiving further communication with me, but that is not one way. Please reach out to me and we will connect in all the many ways that we can continue to connect after this event. I want to say thank you to the panelists that are here with me just now. Thank you for your generosity, for your time, for your energy. Thank you to our attendees who also share in the energy that we created tonight. Thank you especially to the individuals who couldn't be here tonight, who were part of the project and are no longer with us. It's a great opportunity to be able to talk about how art can change the world. And so with that, I say thank you once more to art makers, and I hope very much to have a conversation with you all in the future about what's next. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. Thank you very, very much.